Welcome to the chapter on the skeletal system. That's chapter 6. First, we're going to talk about the functions of the skeletal system. There's 5 functions. Number 1 is supports, to provide the body with support, and of course the skeletal shape gives us the human shape as well. Next is protects. That's number 2. Protects internal organs, and the axial skeleton is very important in that function. Number 3 helps make movements possible, and this is primarily the job of the appendicular skeleton of the limbs. They anchor the muscles and allow them to pull and create levers that can then do work and create movement, of course. The 4th one is storing calcium. Calcium is a vital nutrient that is important for many of our cellular processes, and the balance of calcium must be maintained at all times, so storing extra calcium in the bones is very important. And the 5th and the last function that we're going to talk about is hemopoiesis, which is the production of blood cells. And of course this is very important. Primarily during fetal development, the bones, almost the entire marrow cavity of the bones, is functioning as hemopoietic tissue. As we age, this is restricted to certain parts of the bones, usually the ends of the long bones and in the vertebra bodies, some places like that. We have some what we call red bone marrow, where hemopoiesis or red blood cell production is occurring. So just to recap, 5 functions. Number 1, support. Number 2, protect. Number 3, help with movement. Number 4, store calcium. Number 5, hemopoiesis. The next thing we're going to talk about is the classification of the bones, and we classify them by their shapes. So first of all, we have basically 5 different types of shapes, and we're going to go through those now. A, the example in your picture here, is a long bone, and you can see it does look long. There's 2 ends and then a long shaft connecting them. An example would be the femur, which is shown here. B are the short bones. Examples of the short bones are the carpal bones of the wrist, the tarsal bones of the feet. They're somewhat irregularly shaped, but they're a little bit more cuboidal in shape, and they don't have a long shaft, so we call them short bones. Then C, the example there, is called a flat bone, and an example of that would be the parietal bones in the skull. A lot of the other skull bones, like the frontal and the occipital bones, are also flat bones. And these ones actually develop from a different type of tissue in fetal development. We call them a membranous model, and we're going to be talking about the models for ossification, which is really the development of the bones during fetal development. So flat bones come from membranes. Then number 4 is an example of an irregular bone, D here in your picture. These are vertebra, is the best example of an irregular bone. And as you can see, I mean, there really is no rhyme or reason to their shape unless you look at their function in the human body. But just to see that bone shape, it's difficult to come up with a description for that shape. So we just call them irregular. Then the last one here, E, is sesamoid bones. And these are quite rounded bones, and they're usually embedded in tendons and ligaments, and they're useful in joint mechanics. So the example here that you can see is the patella, and it is the largest of the sesamoid bones. There's only a few other sesamoid bones, and they're at the base of the thumb and the base of the great toe. So just to recap, there's 5 different classifications of the bone shapes: the long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and sesamoid bones. Okay, now let's look at a long bone, and we'll be kind of going through the specifics of the different components of a typical long bone. We have the 2 ends called the epiphysis, and then a long shaft connecting them called the diaphysis. And you can see those labeled on the right side of the picture here. On the other side, we can see that we have the articular cartilages. This is represented in blue in the picture, but they're basically the cartilages that cover the ends of the bones where they're going to be touching the other bone and the other side of the joint, and this creates a smooth surface for articulation. Next, you can see the epiphyseal line, and that is where bone growth was occurring before the bone matured completely, and so this is what is left of the growth plate. And they divide the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Next, we have what we call spongy bone or trabecular bone. And this bone is kind of like Swiss cheese. There's a lot of space, but there's a very strong little struts, which we call trabeculae, that create strength and substance to that part of the bone. It's very important that we have this part of the bone because it's very lightweight, and just like a mountain bike or any other structure, we want to have a light skeleton. Otherwise we would have to have very bulky, large muscles in order to move ourselves around, and that would impede our function. Then on the surface of the bone, toward the outside, we have what we call cortical bone. And this cortical bone is very dense and very strong and much heavier as well, but it's a very important structural component of the outside part of the bone. Then in the middle of the diaphysis we have the medullary cavity, and the medullary cavity usually in an adult bone contains what we call yellow bone marrow, which is mostly fat storage. Next we have what we call the periosteum, and the periosteum is a fine layer of connective tissue that covers the very outer surface of the bone, and it helps to house the cells called osteoblasts that are building new bone all around the surface of the bone. And so osteoblasts are the cells that make new bone tissue. There's two other types of cells in the bone that are important, and we'll just mention those now. Osteoclasts, which are the cells that break down the bone. And the reason that we need those is that we sometimes need to reshape the bone and keep it dynamic, the shape as far as that goes. We need to have it dynamic and versatile so that we can change the bones to be strong in the areas that we need them to be strong in. As well as during periods of inactivity, when we don't need the bones to be so strong, the osteoclasts will be active and they'll break bone down. So this is why bed rest, when you're sick, is kind of detrimental, because your bones will actually be broken down by the osteoclasts while you're on bed rest. The same thing happens to astronauts when they're in space. Their osteoclasts are active because we don't have gravity forcing the bones to be, or needing the bones to be strong. So osteoclasts are active in those time periods. Osteoblasts respond to gravity and forces on the bones. They create new bone. The third type of cell is osteocytes, and those are the mature osteoblasts that have surrounded themselves with new bone matrix, and we'll see them in one of the upcoming pictures. We also have what we call endosteum, which lines the inner part of the bone on the medullary cavity, and it is very similar. It's a connective tissue like the periosteum that houses the osteoblasts and osteoclasts and helps to build or reconstruct the bone on the surface. Then you can see the second epiphyseal line here, and then the articular cartilage on the end of the distal epiphysis. We have a proximal epiphysis closer to the body, and then we have a distal epiphysis. Okay, here we have a look at the close-up of the bone tissue. Here you can see the cortical bone very nicely, and then the spongy bone with all the little trabeculae on the left. The cortical bone we're going to discuss most here. You can see the blood vessels that actually pierce and go into the bone. They come along with the periosteum along the surface of the bone and then enter the bone at specific points. The blood vessels that are running up and down vertically are called Haversian canals, and they are surrounded by circular lamina that just kind of go around them like the rings on a tree. And those units of one blood vessel with all the lamina around it is called an osteon. Many, many osteons together create the dense cortical bone that creates the strength around the surface of our bones. You can look in the close-up circle here and see how the cells actually fit into the picture. Here you have a Haversian blood vessel surrounded by its lamina, and then these little dark spaces. That's where the mature osteocytes live, and we call them lacuna, those spaces. The lacuna are all connected to the blood vessel by tiny little caniculi, and that's where nutrients can diffuse out from the blood to the cells, and where waste products from the cells diffuse and go back to the blood vessels. Here's a micrograph showing some of the same things. In the center you can see that kind of lighter circle, that's where the blood vessel was, and then those dark spots are the lacuna out toward the surface, and you can see the little caniculi going out to the lacuna in a single osteon here. This bone is very dehydrated, obviously, but that kind of gives you an idea of what the tissue is like. Now we can compare the bone tissue that you just saw on the last slide to what cartilage looks like. Cartilage, as you can see here, has no blood supply and no nerves. You can just see that there's this kind of protein cartilaginous matrix, which is sort of like plastic almost, And then you have these cells, the little lacuna for the chondrocytes. Chondrocytes are the cells that make up the cartilage, and you can see how they look here. Okay? The way they get their nutrition is through diffusion, so their matrix is slightly more liquidy, of course, than the more gel-like than the bone matrix, and so nutrients can diffuse through their matrix a lot easier than they can through the bone matrix. And that's how they get their nutrition, rather than through direct blood supply. Here we can see how bones develop. First of all, on the left in the upper row, you can see the first cartilaginous model that will be developed in the fetus. This starts to appear, I think it's within 4 to 8 weeks of the embryo's development. And then as we move on, you can see that the cartilage, which has no blood supply, is reached by a blood vessel. The blood vessel brings in oxygenated tissue, and this pink area is what we call the ossification zone. Where the blood vessel has arrived, there's enough oxygen for osteocytes to migrate in. And here you can see osteocytes have migrated in, and they've started to ossify. In the orange, that's what the orange represents there in the third diagram. They've started to ossify the bone. And you can see the ossification is moving out and out toward the ends. Next, we have what we call a secondary ossification center. The first blood vessel to come was started a primary ossification center, and the second one to come, as you can see here on the end, on the bottom row, is the secondary ossification center. So blood vessels enter both ends of the bone and start 2 secondary ossification centers as well. Then the secondary and the primary ossification centers start to grow out towards each other, and the middle model on the bottom row is really what the bones look like during childhood. And here they're growing closer and closer together, but we still have some cartilaginous zone here where the bone can grow in length. So we have new cartilage being laid down, and then ossification centers growing into that new cartilage. And then the last diagram shows a mature adult bone where you have nothing left but an epiphyseal line where the growth plate was. So just to recap, the first row shows fetal development, and then the last part starts with the bones, with what they would look like at birth, during childhood, and then finally during adulthood.